I'll get colored index cards, and I'll get a corkboard and post-it notes, and I'll get all the flashy new apps and devices, and I'll have this perfect system for plotting something out. And then I do that for a couple of days, and I get frustrated, and then I just end up writing it all in one giant long document. Hi, I'm Jordan Prosser. My debut novel is called Big Time, and it's published by UQP. Big Time is about a rock band in Australia in the early 2040s preparing to record and tour their sophomore album. At the same time, there's a new hallucinogenic drug on the scene known as F, which when applied to your eyeballs allows you to see into the future. And so the bass player of the band comes home after a year overseas, gets hooked on this new drug, and the band embarks on their tour, which very quickly goes off the rails. And very soon the bass player is sort of drawn into this rebellion, this uprising that is trying to overthrow the totalitarian regime that is now ruling the eastern states of Australia. It didn't start as a short story. There is one chapter in the book which featured as a short story for which I won the Peter Carey Short Story Award in 2022, and that's how the novel came about, basically. I won that prize, and then before I even left the ceremony, I had an email from my publisher, Aviva at UQP, being like, oh, I'd love to read the short story. And she read that, and then she said, have you got anything else? And I said, well, as a matter of fact, this is one standalone chapter in a novel, of which I'd written about half the full manuscript at that time. And so, it was a very standalone chapter, so it does function as a short story, and there's a couple of chapters in the book that do. And then sort of the themes and ideas and the events in those chapters gradually filter their way into the main narrative. But yeah, she was thrilled to learn that it was part of a longer work, and that's how the book came to be. It was great that she, Aviva really connected with the short story first, and even though it's quite different, the actual plot of that story, it's very different to the main narrative of the book. It has a lot of the same themes in it. So I think as soon as she was sold on those, she was very, very eager, very interested in what the rest of the book was about. And so I think I pitched it just sort of, the way I've always tried to pitch it is like this really fun, really zippy road trip adventure, basically, but using that as something to anchor these, very heady, very sort of like philosophical and metaphysical ideas about time and fate and causality. And I think, certainly the thing I tried to do was balance those two things out. So it never gets too esoteric. It never gets, too sort of like tunnel vision in terms of just the bare bones plot. Julian Ferryman is the lead character, the protagonist, but not the hero. In fact, I quite enjoyed the idea of really telling a story with a main character who has had this kind of like thrust upon them. You always hear about the hero's call for the hero's journey and everything, like Bilbo Baggins receives the ring, et cetera, and they take up the cause. It's like, what if the hero hears that call and they just don't want any part of it? That's just like, ugh, can I not be the hero? Because he's this kind of like apolitical, like slacker bass player who actually fits in quite well, quite comfortably into the sort of retrograde, like fascist dictatorship, as in he's happy to just kind of like keep doing what he's always done, keep making like really innocuous, popular, harmless music. Unfortunately for him, everyone else around him is sort of undergoing this political awakening and trying to turn the tides. And he gets swept up in it. Everyone's trying to kind of save the world, and all he really wants to do is be making his solo EP. So he's this at times really, really difficult, really grating, quite selfish character who, the narrator in the book says, he describes Julian as having been lifted up by dumb luck and circumstance. And that's really all that he is. And you have this protagonist who's constantly actually fighting back against his mission or his duty that everyone else has sort of put upon him. Are they likable and is it important? They're both very interesting questions. I think the most likable characters in my book are actually really the sort of the ancillary characters, the ones who round out the rest of the entourage. Because the main characters for me are all are all very representative of these sort of extreme and competing points of view. You have the characters who are kind of willing to just retreat to the old and the familiar and never open their minds to anything new. Then you have the characters who basically want to like burn everything to the ground and start anew. And and like personally, and I don't think anyone should agree with either one of those things. I think the truth is in the middle. Um, and it's the characters surrounding our sort of like core trio who I think are actually allowed to be the most just like normal people and kind of have their own lives and their own like loves and losses and interests and peculiarities. And then the characters in those like vignette chapters as well, of which there are sort of 4 or 5, the characters who whose story takes place somewhere else. Those characters I think are much more heroic than than the ones in the actual main narrative, because they all kind of lose something, and the stories are about them, going about setting out to try and get it back or restore it or understand it in some way. So writing about a band, I think like many things, came from a place of envy a little bit. Like I've been an actor and a writer and many things, but one thing I've never done and I always wanted to do was be in a band. I just think they're the coolest. I still do. I've always been obsessed with music and going to gigs. So failing, this is probably the closest I'll ever come. This is my attempt to like live that life, at least, in a secondhand sort of way, vicariously. And yeah, in terms of researching it, I've just, been to heaps of gigs. I watched a lot of music documentaries. I read some amazing books. There's one really great book by an author called Michael Azerrad called Our Band Could Be Your Life. And it's like a chapter by chapter. Each chapter focuses on a new band sort of in the emerging punk scene in California in the late 70s, early 80s. So it's like Black Flag and Minutemen and Dinosaur Jr. and, the very sort of like anti-establishment voices that were coming up around that time, which I thought was really a good reference point, because the Acceptable's second album in the book is veering a lot more towards punk. So yeah, just a lot of reading and a lot of listening. And then also, I'm friends with a couple of the members of a Melbourne band called Have Hold. They're sort of like a post-punk prog rock 4-piece. And they let me sit in on a few of their sessions, their recording sessions. So I got to familiarize myself with, the cadence of those sessions and listen to the vocabulary. And then one of the members, Luke, was kind enough to read the entire manuscript through and be like, that's not what that means. That's not what that means. And actually fix up some of the musical language as well. So I didn't, come across as a complete rookie. One answer is I started the book in 2014, as in I wrote the first 2 or 3 chapters about 10 years ago. Really just for a lark, because I always wanted to write a book, and I used to write a lot of prose, and I wanted to see whether I kind of still had that muscle. But then I put it down for 7 or 8 years, sort of sat on a shelf. And then in 2021, in the second sort of the final really long lockdown that we had in Melbourne in that year, just for my own sanity, I picked it up. I was waiting for the film industry, sort of where I normally work, to come back after 18 months of setbacks. And then, I'd quit my full-time job thinking, hey, this is it, we're out of the woods. And then we get thrown back into the 112-day lockdown or whatever it was. And I just needed to do something. I needed some sort of outlet. And the themes of the book about the world sort of being divided up, and especially Australia feeling so like, our lives were kind of shrinking down so much, I think that really put me in mind of the book that I'd started. It actually kind of spoke to me in that moment. So I picked it up. I'd written half of it by June the next year when the Peter Carey Awards happened. And then it took me another year to finish the rest. So I guess if you want to say in concentrated terms, it was about a 2 to 3 year writing process. Screenplays are all about showing, not telling. That's kind of the number one rule you always get told is like show, don't tell, show, don't tell. And the fun thing with books is sometimes you can just tell. Sometimes you can just like zip into a character's brain and be like, they were feeling this without having to physically demonstrate it. But it's still a good thing to keep in mind. It's still a good way to force yourself to try and think, I think, about the narrative and about what's happening, and trying to find more creative ways of explaining things. It also teaches you economy, I think. Screenplays are often like economy of language. Screenplays have to be so tight and so efficient. And again, the joy of a book is they can be languid and they can go for much longer and you can go off on tangents. But again, that thing about extremes, it's like, I think a good book has got to be like balanced somewhere in the middle of those things where it doesn't get completely away from itself. But it also takes time. Sometimes it takes the long road. Plotting the book, I found challenging in the way that I always find plotting my screenplays challenging. I always sit down and I think to myself, I'll get colored index cards and I'll get a corkboard and post-it notes and I'll get all the flashy new apps and devices and I'll have this perfect system for plotting something out. And then I do that for a couple of days and I get frustrated and then I just end up writing it all in one giant long document. And that's where it lives. So I wish I had some like, whiz bang solution to these things, but ultimately it's just like thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of words, often in my notes app on my phone. But the plotting for this, even though there's a lot of things that kind of, like come back that like loop through at the end, I still often find that even plots, sometimes you only encounter it like as you're writing it. Like there are these huge plot twists that happen in the book that only really occurred to me kind of mid-sentence when I was writing another chapter of it, which feels scary in a way because I think you're always setting out and writing something without the fully fleshed out version of it. I'm sure there are writers who do. I'm sure they have every chapter, every paragraph planned to the letter. But I actually quite enjoy where even the plotting is a little bit of improvisation. Sometimes that's where some of the really fun stuff comes from, I think. I actually really did enjoy editing. I don't do a lot of it. I know there are some writers who are really good at just sitting down and doing a vomit draft, and then they'll do like 3, 4, 5, 6 edits later. I'll kind of like just think and agonize and maybe take notes for years and then sit down, and when I write it, I'll be fairly happy with it, I think. And then the editing, we maybe just did like 2 passes at the edit with my actual editors. And that's why it was enjoyable, was because the editors at UQP were so great. Lauren Mitchell and then Ian C., who both did a pass at it. Like I was so nervous going into it because it's my first book, my first time going through this process. I was so terrified that they would kind of like make me change so much. And it's a long book too. So I was like, this is going to be grueling. But every suggestion they had just made something that I already loved even better. It was just like, it was a really light touch. I mean, I say that, it was thousands of changes, but the stuff that they were changing was just like a little thing there, a little sprinkle there, and somehow it just elevated it completely, So I ended up liking the book even more, where so often you hear about, especially in filmmaking, you hear about people kind of getting to the end of the editing process and it's like, oh, it's nothing like what I originally wanted or imagined. It's been kind of like, it's had its soul kind of sucked out and other people calling all the shots. It's the complete opposite of that. It just made it a better version of what it already was. I wrote the book not really thinking of a target audience, really just thinking for myself. Because it was, as I mentioned before, a lockdown project, something to pass the time, something to feel like I still had a creative bone in my body. And so I genuinely thought, because I had no connections in publishing, I had made no attempts to write a book, I'd won no prizes, so I wasn't about to be like, this is my first novel. I literally, genuinely thought that I would read it, my partner would read it. I thought maybe I could send out like a chapter at a time in a Substack for some friends, and that maybe like a dozen or so people would get to enjoy it, and it would just be a little personal project, of which I've had many, and they're all just as gratifying and useful. So yeah, that's how I set out writing it. I set out to write a kind of book that I love, a kind of book that I enjoy reading. And it is very much that. It's very much to my own tastes. So it's not trying to be sort of anything other than that. I will say though, having written half the book and then it getting acquired for publication, the second half was a lot harder to write because then I knew other people would read it. And all of a sudden I wasn't just writing for myself. I was writing for however many people would end up reading the finished product. And so it became a lot harder in that moment, actually. There was a lot more second guessing, being like, is that what I would write if it was just me reading it? Or am I now trying to cater to some imaginary audience, So there was actually a lot more second guessing that happened during the second part of the writing process. I'm working on a couple of new books. One of them's very, very different in tone and scale. much smaller sort of personal drama set in Melbourne, present day. And then the other one is completely in the vein of Big Time. It's sort of a enormous globe-trotting paranormal mystery. And yeah, and other than that, I've got a couple of screenplays that I'm working on now. The film industry finally picked itself up and dusted itself off. Maybe not, to its full original standing or health, but it's getting there. So I have a couple of screenplays that I'm developing with friends, and yeah, it's been a really busy year, but a good busy. Pleasure. Thank you for having me.